Hi, good evening. Um, for the two of you who don't know me yet, I'm, I'm Kuko Manfo, Assistant Professor of Architecture here at Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Welcome to the next installment of our fantastic college lecture series, which is titled Plenty. Today's lecture is by DK Osseo Asare, Associate Professor of Architecture and Engineering Design at the Pennsylvania State University, where he directs the Humanitarian Materials Lab, HUMAT Lab. DK is a Ghanaian-American designer who collaborates with communities to craft material assemblies tuned for ecosocial resilience. He co-founded Low Design Office, LowDO, a transatlantic architecture studio known for innovative place-based work. DK has led participatory design projects across West Africa, and he was the 2024 Architecture and Design Fellow of USA Artists. He was also my second ever boss, but he doesn't want me to call, call him my boss, but he was my second ever boss. This event is part of this year's Binda Lecture Series, which honors Guido Binda, who practiced architecture in Western Michigan for 7 decades. Guido, with his wife Elizabeth, created this fund to provide for an exhibit program and an annual lecture by visiting professionals. It's also supported by the Africa Alliance, which is a hub of urban scholars, practitioners, and educators whose work relates to the African continent as both a geographical and epistemic location. Welcome, DK.
Thank you, Kukwa, and thank you all for being here. And I guess it's good because you're all high, so that means I can look up and try and keep good posture. Can you guys hear me? I don't think I have to lean into the mic too much. Great. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here, actually to be back. I said earlier I've been here several times, and then I realized I've actually only been here in person once, but severally when we were all living in Zoom land, so it feels somehow like a space I'm familiar with. I want to speak with you all today about what it says here, low design in a high-tech world. I think the high-tech world part is probably self-explanatory, and maybe the low design part is also somehow logical, since my firm is called, or the firm I co-founded with Ryan Ballum and Ashley here and other folks, Low Design Office, or LowDO, is very much organized around the idea of low design and lowness. So that is what I want to talk about, but I want to actually try and explain to you what we mean by low design. First, I guess this is just to show you we're in the process of, this is our new office in Austin, so if you're there next, come and visit us. The address is 705 West 29th Street. We're just down from UT. You can maybe see there's a kind of metal frame on the outside that just put in. This is exciting for us because we're interested in sustainability, and also we're interested in scale and the different ways to think about and work with scale. Also, if you've been to Texas, it gets really hot, and so we're also interested in the ways that we can use living systems to reduce heat. So this is going to become a kind of living system where we can test some of our ideas on ourselves. Also, we've done a lot of work in West Africa around what we call kiosk culture, which is sort of very small scale fabrication. And so it's fun. This is a new build that we're kind of skinning and rebuilding from the inside. And it's part office and part makerspace. So it's fun in a way to now be sort of really living and working inside of a kind of living and growing kiosk, which is about to have a whole little ecosystem of other spaces around it on the outside. We are very much a design build practice, so for the most part, if we design it, we will build it, and we've done that from the scale of furniture to houses, 20-acre botanical gardens. We've done 2 new towns, one in Nigeria for 35,000 people, and one in Ghana for 150,000. So yeah, this essentially is what we're sort of unboxing right now. in terms of how to, in a way, continue our experiment of what it means to, and this is what I'll also try and show you a bit today, what it means to be a transatlantic practice. I pulled up a bunch of the houses that we've done in Texas, especially Hill Country. We now have a new restaurant that's going into construction and some new commercial spaces, but really in Texas, the work has started with houses to the point where now we realize we are in the beginning of developing much more of a sort of system of housing. So I did grab a bunch of those projects, but they're, for the most part, also largely documented on the website. So I've just sort of decided to invert a little bit the talk, so I won't sort of dive directly into them. I may, if I have time, come back in. I'm obviously more than happy to speak to them. But because in a way, like I said, some of that information is a little bit more accessible, I wanted to specifically speak to what we mean by lowness and how our ideas about lowness have informed and really influenced certain aspects of the practice. So to start with, previously we've said this, so I mean, yeah, architecture is a pyramid scheme. There are a lot of different ways you can either dispute or dissect that, but you've all seen these type of diagrams probably many years ago when you learned geometry, and this is the diagram that they show you of a pyramid to explain to you what an apex is versus the base. So we all know it as a kind of geometric kind of reference. We also know, obviously, the kind of scammy side of a pyramid scheme, where essentially you're sort of scooping up the profits of those below in order to maximize the profits of those on top. But what's important is that when you see really incredible works of architecture, like Kahn's library here at Yale, you have to trace it back in the context of this is from, I want to say 60s, right? It says here, 1960 to 63. We have to put that in the context of the first pyramids. This is going back to Djoser's step pyramid. I think this is either, maybe I want to say 3rd dynasty, ancient Egypt. And this is 2600 BC. So it's quite a bit in the past, but as a reference for the profession, it has always been architects, literally the ones who can tell you how to build such a structure. How do you build this pyramid? And how do you enable the, let's say, tectonic magic that allows all these materials to be assembled by means of labor and physics, and then somehow stay up in the air, close to the divine realm. So for us, we started and we got interested. I realized this morning I said 2006, and then I said, oh no, it must have been 2016. But I realized it was 2006 is when we were in grad school and we started our practice. We started essentially getting out of studio at the GSD and engaging with communities to try and do work. And it was because we were kind of nervous about being groomed to only deliver architecture design services to elites within society. And we were kind of wondering, what does it mean to engage the base? And for us, the prompt for lowness was particularly the recognition that in general, when you really look closely, you'll find that typically high art borrows from the low. The things that you see in the museum are inspired by something that happened on the street. And so we said this is somehow a little bit duplicitous to focus on this high culture or fine art and neglect its symbiotic relationship with lowness. And furthermore, we realized that life, at least on this planet, exists relatively low to the ground. If you know all these words, you probably know there's a kind of through line, Om or Aum, a mantra that speaks to essentially not only, let's say, the energetic qualities of the universe, but also the power of silence. We know that hum is the thing that we hear when we go out into nature, but we may not necessarily realize that that same hum is the hum within human, meaning the spirit that can exist over time. And it's the same hum that exists in humor, originally meaning good spirits, humus, that living layer of organic material that lives within the soil and makes it alive, and our notions of home as a place where you dwell and exist within space and have continuity. Humility, humor, humid and humus, the organic portion of terrestrial matter, the living soul of the soil, all bear the root phonemes, aum, that when joined with silence consonate om, that four-syllable mantra unifying earth, atmosphere, and the cosmos, the hum of life itself. Nature seeks balance. Woven into the fabric of universe is the transformative power of thinking small. There's actually a sort of classical notion of the purpose of life is actually to be able to obtain or maintain qualities of good spiritedness as a goal. Not purely pleasure or happiness, but an ability to actually maintain a level of low stress. And that's been our kind of goal in terms of the office. To show you a complex project in just 3 slides, we worked with a community in Anambra State in Igbo land in the eastern part of Nigeria, broadly speaking, part of the Niger River Delta, to develop a new town. And working with the community over a multiple year participatory planning process led to the publication of the Anam City Master Plan, which was an open source kind of toolkit for how to think about a sustainable new town development in the African context. But this is one that was informed by virtue of working with the community on their traditional Igbo principles of land use, which starts with the recognition that the land itself is a deity, it's divine, it is the entity which supports all of our lives, and we have to recognize that dependence. And there's a very specific gradient that exists between the, let's say, more formalized spaces of domesticity to the transient spaces of farmland, and then finally the active preservation of wild spaces as a place reserved not for people, but for animals and for those spirits that have direct access with the land itself. This is a project which is still ongoing. We built the first neighborhood. Now it's sort of all become a kind of school. It was one of our proudest achievements was actually getting it into Google. So if you ever put a new town into Google, there's a whole process, has to go through review and all kinds of people checking. And so when your new town is basically a site that's on a site that's half of the year an island, there's a whole process. But eventually you get through, and like I said, it's still ongoing. But the reason why I mention it here is that what was particularly significant working in this context was you're taking materials directly from where you're using them. We built many of these bamboo structures because they were low cost. We could do them fast and quick. And also we were able to obtain bamboo by actually talking with the local, it's called Otos, the deity of the bamboo forest, and negotiating and essentially requesting access to use these materials, and at their end of life, they can return directly back into the soil. And so this was really, for me, a very profound recognition of a model that we use now at Penn State. I teach the capstone design project or thesis essentially for M.Arch students, and we often refer to this model of living and building, where if you recognize that essentially living at its core speaks to qualities of motion, and building at its core speaks to stasis and the ability to build up something or to accumulate things in a particular place, and recognizing architecture as this negotiation between constant flux and flow of materials and energy, entities, but also, again, viewed from an African context, spiritual dimensions of reality. All of this sort of exists within the spaces where we sort of try to intervene, and ultimately recognizing that we are doing nothing more than trying to modulate all of these flows of energy and materials over time. So this is a project that we worked on or have been working on now for, I believe, it's over 10 years. This is one of the projects that Kuko was involved in many years before, along with some of the young people that you see here in this image from Ashesi University in Ghana. And it was to engage with a landscape called Agwagloshi, which was essentially, uh, let's say, a green space that became colonized as a scrapyard. And it led to very sort of desolate spaces like this, where you see not only sort of dump sites, but also a lot of very highly polluting processing of e-waste. And working within these spaces, sorry, just one second. Okay, sorry. So yeah, working within these spaces where if you think about this notion of high tech, and I think you all know what e-waste is. So this is a place where essentially you can see e-waste go to its end of life, and a space where you have to engage the material footprint of all of these components of the so-called smart city. And so working with young people, both from the scrapyard and also students really from what we call the whole range of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and arts and mathematics backgrounds, we work to map this whole community, understand the processes that were involved not only with bringing all of these waste products from the city to the site, but also processing those materials and sourcing components back out of them. But it was also a process that was deliberately planned over a extensive period of time to think about not just trying to solve a local problem, but trying to develop a technology which could be shared elsewhere. And this is a project where, in the process of trying to think about how can we engage this community and support innovation processes, it led to a recognition that in the context of a scrapyard, and by extension, all of our sort of modern society, materials don't have a static life, but actually everything that we make at the end of its life has to be unmade. And so recognizing that things that may have a form also have a transformal nature, and thinking through those cycles of making, unmaking, repair, and remaking led to essentially the core of this project. The other extension of this is that in the context of Ghana, you have a kind of bifurcation in education, where a lot of young people are learning in what's called the informal sector, and others are learning in classrooms not unlike this. One set of students has a very practical education, and the other one has a very theoretical one. And so the notion of this project of AMP, I'm trying to think about connecting them together, was to think about bringing together the technical knowledge of folks who are trained for, in essence, the professions, with the hand-on, practical, entrepreneurial, let's say, energy of the rest of this society. And over time led to the development of this mobile, prefabricated, deployable makerspace, which not only can function as a pop-up makerspace, but also can pack inside of a crate and be deployed. So to think about this as a kit of parts means that actually you're not just designing the overall building, even if it's small, but you're actually designing each component and the ways in which these components can be put together. And this put us really in, let's say, a position of straddling the world of architecture and design with the broader arena of maker culture, and to think about the ways in which urbanism and the ways that future urbanism are produced do not necessarily have to be constructed purely through the design imagination of skilled and highly trained professionals, but can in essence be democratic. And how can we have not only the aspects of design, but also of manufacturing or production of architectures, how can this be inclusive? And the motivation for this is that if you look at the continent of Africa, which is today the youngest continent on the planet, it's the only world region that is still experiencing growth. All the other world regions are essentially maxing out their human population, and moving into the future will be declining in population. By the end of this century, there's going to be hundreds of millions more young Africans coming into, in essence, the, however, choose your language, labor force, job market, coming of age, and looking to build futures. And this image on the left shows all the kind of current technology and innovation hubs distributed across the geopolitical nation-state boundaries of African, on the right shows the nation states, and on the left looks at essentially a Voronoi distribution. And so for us, the motivation is to think about how can we develop a makerspace that allows young people to not only repair, unmake, fix the technology that they have, but also to be active makers and not just consumers of future technology, which means you have to be able to make these small makerspaces that can be deployed at large scale across the continent. I say all of this because this is one of the core aspects of low design, meaning which is open design. And if you design something purely for yourself, and then you let other people have access to it, it's not the same thing as designing something with other people and then sharing the thing that you designed back with them. So this shows a map of, at this point, we've worked across 6 continents. Over 2,000 young people, especially from North America, Europe, and West Africa, have collaborated in a whole host of maker workshops, design hackathons, all forms of activities. But what's essential is that these activities are not independent, but are actually highly coordinated to develop a series of technologies which can be versioned and which can be shared. So if there's nothing else that you remember from today, this is the thing that I would hope you remember, which is that if someone says something like open design or open source architecture, and they try to make it sound complicated, recognize that actually it's super, super simple. Essentially, you have a spectrum of whether something is open or whether something is closed. And we can think about design as something closed or something open, but oftentimes in the world of architecture, our focus of inclusion is really on the front end. We have things like focus groups or community meetings where we have ideation, people share the things they like or they don't like, or you have community review where you might send presentation, you might show presentation of a current version, and you can receive feedback. What you do with that feedback is largely up to the process in which you're involved. But if you see this middle, you'll notice that if you think fundamentally about, you can think as in shorthand blueprints, right? But the actual information, the design documentation that allows you to know how to make a particular thing, whether that thing is a piece of software, an airplane, an automobile, an electronic device, or a building, you can think about the design documentation that allows you to use that to, for example, plans to build your own house, the ability to contribute to a project. So if you have ideas or you have suggestions about how something could be done better, is there a forum where you can actually introduce those ideas and they will be received and incorporated? If at the end of the day all of this work is done, who owns the outcome? Is that something that resides in the public domain, or is that owned by private interests? So all of these things have to do with whether something is open or something is closed. And for us, that's a fundamental reason why, through this process of participating with makers in all these different spaces to iteratively build series of maker spaces, the goal has never been any one single individual instance of those, but rather the slow, not that we want it to be slow, but by its nature it oftentimes is, the iterative development of this, in this case, what we call the AMP spacecraft, a space for crafting, which is this pop-up a mobile deployable makerspace, first developed in Ghana. We did a technology transfer from Ghana to Senegal for the Dakar Biennale, and then they used that as a pop-up fab lab, and it's even traveled from Senegal to Mauritania and then back again. So even the architecture itself is moving between countries. This participation is mobile, so you have people working together from all over the world, but the key, as I said, is that this participation is a network. And I'm just going to really quickly move you through some of these spaces. This is starting with one of the repair shops in that same scrapyard, where we early on recognized that what was oftentimes demonized just as a place where things were thrown away was actually a place where people were scavenging and were in a way cannibalizing all the detritus of the city and using that to build, like, for example, in this case, new computers. So for us, at the beginning, the idea of the makerspace was to think about how we could think about a small micro building as essentially a large machine that you can walk into. So here you see early tests of these aerial trolleys, which we're making as small sort of gantry cranes. The intention for this is to become an overhead, essentially robotic arm system that can support humans in fabrication, but which can be made locally in makers. Here's one of this same makerspace in the scrapyard, and this is the first two modules where it really becomes a kind of community hub. This is right at the entrance of the scrapyard, where whenever somebody brings in new scrap, people can monitor and see if it's worth their while. And as you can sort of see behind this door, we essentially plugged into this community and focused on what does it mean to make a makerspace, not in the context of, say, a privileged institution, but really at the grassroots, where the kinds of machines and tools that people were most focused on were the things that were most useful to their everyday life. So here's an instance where, as you can see, literally they were working on the structure, working on welding, and someone passes by and says, "Hey, I have a cart, I need to weld it, can you help me with this problem?" And so everyone's like, "Yeah, we can do that, but we're gonna have to get these guys to move their motorcycles, and then we can open up this door, and then we should be able to try and take care of you." So you can see, even in terms of the scale, we're trying to think about architecture at the scale of the vehicle, the prefabricated structure. We also call it chassis because it's conceived of as the early stages of what is meant to be also mobile architecture, where the wall you see here opens up as a bifold hangar door and becomes a roof extension that allows the interior space to essentially flow directly into the outdoors, which in the context of West Africa is actually quite useful. You don't want to be trapped inside of this hot box when there's airflow on the outside. And as you can see, in this case, when people are coming and going and bringing things, it allows the building itself to function as a workbench, once again blurring the boundaries between architecture and furniture. And even the components of this were designed in a way to be modular, so not only did they function as lock boxes, which can store your tools from other folks, but actually the workbench itself sort of slots into these sort of toolboxes, and the whole system becomes a kind of mobile workspace which can exist even outside of the building itself. I'll show you here. Here's an example of the makerspace that the young people made in Dakar, where they have a fab lab, but it's actually, at that time it was in a garage, and so they use this as a pop-up fab lab to take their makerspace out literally into the street, introduce young, not even just young people, but introduce people to what 3D printing is. And also because they're essentially operating on their own, they also use the same venue as a store where they can sell some of the things that they're producing and experiment. Like here you can see they had sensors that were monitoring the temperature and humidity of plants that they had. They had a bicycle that was generating electricity to play movies. So it's a kind of point of congregation and bringing people together, as well as blurring the boundaries of what is inside and what is outside. Earlier on, I showed you the sort of drawings of the kit of parts. But here you can see that logic in fast forward is that if you're working in one of these informal sector sites, the ground itself is literally uneven. And so even to have a place to start thinking about doing things in a coherent, let alone precise way, or to introduce quality in terms of craft processes in such a context, you literally do need to create a space to craft. And so that's the inherent logic of a kind of self-leveling, self-structural, prefabricated system, which not only can self-assemble itself, but actually can function as the equipment that you can use to assist yourselves in the process of making it. It also allows, these are actually scrap dealers from the scrapyard. They're not trained architects or builders. Although one had been trained as a mechanic, so he became the kind of instructor for the kind of bolted connections. But again, you can see how the building itself can assemble with itself. That same structure traveled here. You see it in ZKM, the museum in Karlsruhe, and these are actually Masters of Architecture students who are also trying to assemble it, while in the background you can see the video of the folks in the scrapyard doing their quality control checks before they sent it. They got a big kick out of it for them sending this thing from a scrapyard where they're used to scrapping old Mercedes-Benz sort of vans from Germany, and here they were sending something back. But this is a dialogue that allows all of these folks to work together on the sort of co-development, and then the makerspace continued to function as a pop-up, and actually makerspace for workshops in the museum, and then moved out into the city of Karlsruhe, and then traveled on to Zurich, where it was part of a show called Radical Repair in the Design Museum in Zurich. And we also, you can see here on the wall, we actually iterated the next version with the same group of makers in Ghana of what we call this Parawall, as well as kind of these modular components. And we were excited that we were exhibited right next to the VW Bug as icons of design. But that same spacecraft is now in Austin, Texas, where it's just been used in a second sort of theatrical performance. So for us, the notion of a spacecraft as a space for crafting is really intended to be not just to say a space for using 3D printers, but really a place for unlocking the imagination. I know that I'm more or less at time, but I want to just show just a few images of this project to maybe reinforce that same notion, and also this idea of unlocking creative potential and possibility. For us, the key with participation as a way of low design being a way of lowering the barriers to architecture and participation in design processes is that once not enough, history matters, and you really have to focus on versioning. So this is an example where in just a few minutes, I'll show you a project which began as a proposal for MoMA PS1. We called it Bambot Fufuzela as a kind of alternative to robots. Robot, if you know, is actually a word which etymologically speaks to notions of being a slave. And we propose the idea of what does it mean if we think about architecture as truly emancipated, as living creatures that can exist within our society, but are not sort of required to do our bidding, but essentially entities that we can think about in terms of rewilding the city. So these were sort of proposal sketches. This is the one that MoMA decided to exhibit in the show. And here's the sort of model when we were sort of demounting the day of. But for us, this was really a prompt to really start to unlock the possibilities of this. And we continued this project, even though MoMA wasn't really convinced that we could build it. They're like, how can you guys do all this bamboo stuff? We continued actually working with the government of Ghana. We wrote this chapter looking at the future of Pan-African museums, Presidential Commission looking at the future of museums, monuments, and natural heritage in the country. And for the chapter of architecture, we proposed these Fufuzela as free architectures in opposition to the notion of the museum as a white box where you put things inside to preserve them, but instead the museum that is free to walk around the city. So we made these initial drawings, and that led to essentially several years of prototypes starting on the left, actually in the same scrapyard, actually the very edge of it, in a school, where the same scrap community worked together making this first bamboo structure before it became part of a national exhibition of emerging Ghanaian contemporary artists in Germany, and then continued as the Ghana Pavilion at Venice, and then following as a installation you see on the right called Enviromolecular. And so this is looking at the notion of an architecture which is not fixed in place and which can move around. So I will maybe just show you some of these images to show how it has moved across the exhibition spaces. And similarly for this first show in Dortmund, the curator, Nana Foriata Ayim, was able to actually negotiate for a number of objects that were looted from Ghana during the colonial period and were held in private collections to have these exhibited as part of the show. And for each of these objects, we deployed these structures as essentially a home for the spiritual rehabilitation of these objects, and working with essentially traditional knowledge keepers from Ghana. We went through a sort of essentially certain amulets and energetic sort of, let's say, elements were brought into the space to support these objects, which were very significant cultural artifacts in their host communities, to support them in their sort of future eventual journeys back. And we're able to sort of also transition to digital fabrication of the components, a whole host of different experimental orientations, and this eventually led us to the ability to use this as the infrastructure for Ghana's second pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which essentially we did with a budget of nothing, because we were able to reuse or upcycle components from a previous exhibition, and work with some amazing young artists from Ghana, as well as collaborators from Brazil. So I'll just maybe close with this. I hope that maybe if you encounter this idea of lowness or low design, you can think about it as something beyond just ideas of minimalism or low cost. But what I wanted to show you by sharing some of these work that we've done around development of what we call architechnologies is to actually try to work with communities of makers to build the basic building blocks for structural systems of architecture that continue to scale and support what we call future making, but to have this be done not solely by architects or engineers in exclusive research labs or by private companies, but actually to involve everyday people, even people who haven't necessarily gone to advanced programs in specialized design fields. So lowness in this sense allows you to bridge this gap between high and low that the professions themselves perpetuate. And ultimately, this allows you to think about models and modes of participation, which ultimately allow you to have a framework to take on what we call wicked problems, which are these problems that are too large and too complex for not only you to entirely understand on your own, but to take on independently by yourself. Inherently, you're going to have to involve other people. And so then the question is, are you designing a system of architecture, or let's say knowledge or information architecture, that can support the design of such architecture? Thank you.
While we're dreaming up and thinking of questions, I'll use my moderator privilege to ask the first one, which is also a very selfish one. So DK, you mentioned kiosk culture, and in a totally non-biased, always history kind of way. Will you tell us where this kiosk culture comes from and the ideas behind it come from?
So Kukwa asked me about kiosk culture, but I'll maybe just play this while I say it, because this is the road driving from one side of the scrapyard to our workshop on the other side. And the kinds of things that you see in this video is very common to what you find moving through, let's say, streetscapes in West African cities. Which is to say that there is a scale. Well, first of all, there's not really a road here, although there kind of is, but it floods, so it gets really messy. But you'll notice that really the texture is defined by the scale of the vehicle and all these sort of small businesses that support them. So for me, I did several years of research in a new city called Tema, which is just next to Accra, but very much moving through the city, trying to learn and understand it in the ways that I had been trained in, so let's say, classical education, but somehow it was missing that urban fabric. And what I did find was these spaces of informality. And again, after several years of research, I did a Fulbright. What sort of clicked was that actually these are temporary sites of occupation because they are squatters. And it's a negotiated short-term access to land, which means it's a mobile architecture. And so that's why we've been working with, why we have a workshop in this space and why we've been working on these small structures is that typically we'll say, well, it's not practical to have mobile architectures other than RVs or things on wheels because of a bunch of different reasons. But here is an environment where actually it's a massively scaled urban system when you think and aggregate all the urban landscapes where you have these small spaces. Mm-hmm. So if you saw when I was sort of clicking through, there were a series of axos that showed sort of a kind of box type pavilion in different colors. So that was showing sort of four of the first iterations of that system, that what we call the spacecraft. And so yeah, essentially we had done a first few of them in Ghana. It got attention, and ZKM said, this is interested, we're doing a multiple year research and exhibition project. It culminated in a book called Digital Imaginaries, Africa's in Production. And their interest was like essentially all of Africa's future in terms of digitality. And so it was different artists, designers, maker types. And so it was basically South Africa, Kenya, Dakar. And so it was with support from ZKM that they supported that first technology transfer. And yeah, what it came down to was we had worked with a group of makers in Ghana, and then two of them flew to Senegal along with Yasmin and I for like a week. Well, we were there for like a week. We were in a workshop with like a bunch of young people from Dakar, where we went through a normal process of visioning, and then we also work with a local welder, and then they sort of started making, and then we left, and they continued for the next month, and then it opened for the Biennale. And yeah, the way it worked was essentially the folks that came spoke English and Twi, and then the people there spoke not really even French exactly, sort of, and then basically there were like 5 or 6 languages spoken, but not really the same languages. So it was basically people using I mentioned design documents, so using the drawings that we had produced. And the drawings, you can be read because people share numeracy even if they don't share the language. So basically it was using numbers and drawings and Google Translate, and like that, it worked, and it was pretty magical, both for us as a form of research, but also as a demonstration. And so I don't yet know, as best I know, of like full replications of the project, but we've seen a couple spin-offs, like we said, because it's modular, sometimes people take a piece of it, some of like the truss components, and they just basically make a version of that for whatever they need to do, but not necessarily the full thing. And that's incremental progress towards what we're trying to basically introduce a new standard for the kiosk, but one which is a sort of open standard.
Thanks, Guido. I was wondering about one thing that you're talking about. So you consistently position yourself and your practice, these are the professional practices. And I was wondering to what extent do you position yourself towards the professional practice of architects in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Senegal, right? Because the conditions of this practice are quite specific, the challenges are quite specific, the expectations of clients, the types of clients, for example, a very important role of the state as a client and architect. These are quite interesting practice for the So I was wondering to what extent you reflect on these differences of architectural practice in the sites that you work, and how specifically your response to the West African condition.
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I'll try not to lose you in an answer and try to make it succinct. So I mentioned that we've done a range of scales. So after we did the Newtown, which was a kind of community project, we did a developer-led Newtown project in Ghana, which was like 20 square miles, like the last large, I mean, you probably know this area, Afenya, Dawenya, so very large area. And so that project led to the kinds of conversations that you have with the kinds of folks that invest in projects like that, who have €1 billion or pounds or dollars around. And it was a very aggressive, for me, wake-up call to realize that when you're developing new, and it's not just in that, I mean, we've gone to Newtowns Institute in Rotterdam and participated in new, workshops, TU Delft. So it's pretty common in African context is that the pressure for new urbanism is very much from the financial sector, and they want to build for like a so-called emerging middle class, but really high-end luxury. And there was no space for, let's say, lesser off folks. So it was through that process where I kind of got, for me, a sense of a, let's say, I don't want to say a vision, but I got a flavor of really the macro trends in terms of the ways in which the real estate development pressure, I don't want to say conscripts, but kind of forces the hand of architects in terms of the projects that are available. So after that project, essentially, it encouraged me to double down on my earlier research on the kiosk culture and this makerspace project, because I realized that actually it's kind of the only alternative. It's like either you're going to have this kind of homogeneous kind of rollout of the same kind of glossy wannabe luxury cities that then force out the real city, or you have to find a kind of mechanism that allows, I don't know what I call the real city, but like the maybe more popular city to evolve at a much more rapid rate. So that was, again, that's maybe high level, but that was a kind of recognition. And so that's why I've been focused on this particular technology system. Also because we tried to do it as a building, which was a real tragic, difficult process because we spent several years. We designed this eco lodge for Kakum. It was so exciting, but we could not find any engineers in Ghana who could sign off on it because it was too complicated. And the engineers that could do it in the US, it was like too expensive for the project cost. So that was why now, like in Ghana, I'm not a registered architect, I'm a registered engineer. And has been working with Ghana Institute of Engineering to think about working with these kind of engineering technicians as a potential group of people that actually we could be thinking about as building components of architecture. So absolutely, it's a way of engaging the sort of architectural status quo from the outside, but that's because without going more into the details of the context in Ghana, the financing of projects in Ghana is such that nobody really pays for design. So you're into like really, it's like really weird ways you have to practice. And so, yeah, this is a kind of alternative path that we are attempting. Yeah. Thank you. This question is super interesting. I want to make sure I get it, but I think you're asking like, what's the difference between sourcing new materials sort of locally or from wherever they're coming from versus working with like working with things that are coming from somewhere else, or upcycling, or you reusing the same components, do you mean? Okay. Yeah. Well, one of the simple ones has to do with carbon footprint. So, I mean, we haven't necessarily run the numbers for all of everything, but there's a certain, for us, the goal is to essentially have options. And that's also why I talk about like maker culture. And I mean, it was a bit rushed, but I showed how we essentially started bamboo structures, and then we started working with, essentially you can use sheet material, so either bamboo plywood or even just plywood, and you can use a CNC machine to cut out components. So still trying to think about how you can use biomaterials, but also use digital fabrication. So for us, the interest is to have two options, where on one hand, you don't necessarily have to buy all your components and have them imported to you from Southeast Asia or something. If you have bamboo where you live in Georgia, you could actually potentially just sort of make it locally. So the goal is to encourage people to be able to make locally, but also the ability to reuse parts. So like in Texas, a lot of times when you demo a building, especially if it's filled with lots of nails, just for like even liability reasons or just the cost of labor, it just goes into a landfill rather than being reused. We use a lot, but it's actually really expensive to reprocess all of that stuff so that you can use it again. So we're interested in thinking about the components of buildings such that they themselves can be migratory. It's kind of like you might see places where like we did a project in Gainesville, Florida with UF, where they built a scrapyard. They built a makerspace in the scrapyard, and it was because essentially you can go there and get like a door from like an old building and then use it as a wall. So it's kind of, you can take building components and repurpose them. So absolutely, the interest is to sort of find a way that you can maintain the possibilities that exist within material elements and also free up those elements to maybe be used in ways that they were not originally intended. The last thing I would probably say is that, and I kind of just sprinkled it in there, but hopefully those of you somehow maybe got there, but is that what we learned working in the scrapyard with all these scrap dealers that take apart these materials and who believe, because of the sort of traditional cultural belief systems, that materials are themselves spiritually active and alive. For us, it was a really big wake-up call that materials actually are alive. I mean, we may not think about them that way, and you can decide to model that phrase in a bunch of different ways, as literally or figuratively as you want. But regardless of how you choose to interpret it, they have a life cycle. And so that's a kind of roundabout response to your question. But what you find is that the materials become participants. And so we see this work as also more than human-centered, because not only are you working with things like bamboo groves and other living elements, but also the materials themselves are actively involved. Absolutely, yeah.
I guess in one sense, there's a necessity to deal with validation around the world. And like, what other kind of cultures do you imagine, I guess, that would support working these ways, using material? Like, I don't know, is there like, maybe I'm speaking from personal experience a little bit. I spent all day Saturday at a bike shop and scrapping materials. But is there a way to like build joy and new cultures around reuse?
So I think, again, the short answer I would say is yes, and I also think it's happening. One of the things that's amazing about the world is that it's big, and people have a really incredible ability to self-organize. So definitely, since I've been involved in this work, we've been invited and participated in so many projects all over. And so in most of those instances, I'm typically pretty stunned, because you sort of encounter entire whole communities that are organized around the right to repair, or fixer communities. Sometimes they call them like remakeries. Is like so. I think it's interesting because you have these kind of subcultures, but I definitely think that in a way you're going to probably have continued kind of fragmentation, but you have different. I don't want to say tribes, but there's definitely people that are interested in either authenticity or simplicity. And I also sort of slightly spoke to in terms of lowness, this idea of just looking for low stress. Our devices actually introduce a lot of stress into our lives. And so people like pay lots of money to like go to like a stillness retreat just to like get away from their devices. But you don't need a device to help you not have a device. Like you should be able to actually have a space that does that. So um, I think definitely in this sense, uh, it's possible to, let me say, nurture in a way these kind of emerging communities of people that are looking for alternatives, because there's always going to be incentive for businesses to encourage you to buy more things and to consume more things. So it's kind of just a natural and organic response from some people. On the flip side, we've also found, just in terms of like working with people, that culturally, a lot of these cultures are also like very deeply rooted. So like we went to the Seoul Biennale because in South Korea, they saw the project and they were like, oh my God, this is what we have. Like, and they took us to Sanga, where they were like these like really old people that were like repairing VHS machines and like technologies that almost you would feel like were obsolete, but like they still have customers who have this object and it needs to be fixed, and they fix it. And so, and they have very small little shops and they're repair shops. So even they, again, across the language barrier in like Korean, could be like, oh, yeah, we see what these people are doing in this African context. Like, it also makes sense. And so they got right away what we're doing. And we collaborated with Bare, a Korean group, and did a whole series of kind of like, we did a workshop. We made like a little mobile device thing. So again, I think that culturally speaking, you find that every kind of world region has a kind of cultural roots around making and repair that historically architects were interfacing with, but now we're so focused on our screens that we lose those like social relations or social connections with the people that are working with physical objects and tools and making and repairing objects.
So I'm interested in how you manage this. You mentioned you didn't show, but you mentioned you have a couple of houses or residences in Texas. Interested in how, if at all, you manage to translate or transfer some of these ideas around the design, around information, the manuals and stuff, into these topics as a more
So here's one where we just finished it, and now speaking of incremental, we just finished it, and then the client actually decided they wanted to add on to it. So we just finished it, and then we started adding on to it. So already this idea of things being living and always transformable, this is like, this happens to us a lot. So we'll do a project, and then because we designed them to be able to transform, that's why the system of housing we call is LowDO adaptive housing, sometimes called flex appeal. And so they're designed to be able to have additions, and so it oftentimes happens. Here's an example of one. You'll also see in the kind of school a lot of these indoor-outdoor spaces, so like porches, that comes from the work in Ghana and Nigeria, how to shade the spaces. And then finally, we were just sort of revisiting this project ourselves in the office last week when I was in Austin, because of the fact that it's built around a courtyard. And so a lot of our projects are built around open courtyards or open spaces that then allow the interior-exterior spaces to come together. Oh, the spacecraft?
Yeah. I was wondering how, like, your personal feelings, like your program, feels about it as it travels through these uses. Seems like it was makerspace, then now it's in this sort of secondary phase, museums and theater, and things like that.
I am going to answer your question. All right, well, not like I thought I was going to. I was going to show you another image, but I couldn't find it fast enough. So I showed you an image of it in a black box theater, but right after the black box theater was delivered to a site, and it was again in a pile, a bunch of stuff for like a little while, and then I think someone went and then started to assemble it, and then little by little, and now it's reassembled, and like I said, it's a field office, and we have a kind of temporary roof on it, and we've like last week we were working on the designs for the next wall panel system. So it's not as if it's like left its sort of original trajectory. It's totally very much still in that. And the reason why we just brought it to Texas as opposed to sending it, we were going to send it to Togo, but we selfishly brought it to Texas because we were going to send it to another makerspace, but we wanted to actually work with it ourselves because it's faster testing. But we've built more. I think at this point it's like 8 modules we built. We built the original 2 in Ghana. We built another, I think, 2 in Ghana that went out. Like people have, we don't know where they are now. Like they're used somehow. There was the one in Dakar. There's another 2 modules that we have that we just made that were sent to a school that are like now being used in like a totally different way. So for us, that's the whole purpose of the experimentation, is to build architecture which is modular, but put those modules in the hands of people and see what they do with them, but then not have it disappear, but then go back and see how it's used and fold that back into the process. So it's all very much related, and the modular walls that we're building right now in Austin, it's all part of the same process. That's what we mean by co-creation. So, I mean, I guess the first part was that my real introduction into the world of like informal sector work was let's say through a lens of research. I mean, I did my thesis at the GSD was on that topic with Marco Sanzati and Teddy Cruz. So I started that work, and then I continued as Fulbright, and then it was, like I said, partly through the process of I think during the Fulbright period, it kind of like, you know, when you're in school, you're designing stuff, everyone's like, come up with a solution, come up with a solution, but you're always making an image of the solution. You're not making the solution itself, which, again, if you can't tell, was frustrating for me. So I then made that pivot where I started directly experimenting with the kind of solution. So that's why over, like I said, now it's been quite a number of years, we've been constantly testing with materials these smaller component systems. So like I didn't really go, I mean, this is like kind of probably a lot of stuff, but like you can imagine this times like a lot of things, trying wood components, trying different bamboo structures, trying tied bamboo structures, trying copper tubing, trying like resin casting connections. So we've tried so many different mechanical connections, chemical connections. So in this sense, it's been largely about working towards a future where you can have a component-based system of architecture that people can work with. But because of the fact that I was doing that in Ghana with essentially the people in my neighborhood, meant that I was working with these grassroots artisans. So they were my lab. Like I didn't have a lab separate, like that was the place. So, and because that was also my interest, was to make a democratic kind of architecture, that's sort of how it started. So that was for me, let's say, the path onto that road. But then once I was on that road, I realized like the longer history of it. And we wrote a text occupying Africa, building a transformal network for architectural design in the UK. And in that one, we'd go into more detail of the kind of geopolitical histories of this. But essentially, there is a discourse about sort of specialist versus non-specialist cooperation and collaboration. In a way, for us, it was partly practical, partly a kind of political attitude about architecture of being inclusive. But then also it was that my mentor, Alero Olympio, who was a Ghanaian, Togolese, Scottish architect, she had also introduced this to me when I was sort of learning that her approach to architecture, and she was architect and builder, and so her approach was about working with the community. And so even a number of the team members that I have that work within Ghana were people that I met through her. And so she always encouraged us to think about it as a kind of horizontal, but also kind of vertically integrated community of makers. And as an architect, to put yourself right down on the same level with everyone who's involved with physically putting together. So that was the kind of backstory on that. I feel like you guys would have all run away already, but you're still asking, so I'm here. I'm happy to answer the question, but I don't mind if someone also runs away. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, the short answer is that it's not necessarily easy for us. And the other part of the answer is that the reason why this sort of exists as a practice is because it's collaborative. So my co-founding principal, Ryan Ballum, is Texan. He's born and raised in Texas. And so we met in grad school, and I think our sort of coming together onto this path was both our kind of interest in making things and using our hands, but also a kind of desire to try and democratize. So we met, and I think it was through this common interest that we first started collaborating. And I used to have slides, where originally it was funny because he and his wife, they were in Hawaii and I was in Nigeria. And we were doing work in Colombia, and it was so it was just, whoa, it was very even complicated. And then they're in Texas and I was in Ghana. So it's always been kind of like that. We also have joked that, before everyone started using Zoom and Dropbox, we've always been like that. We used Google Wave, if anyone knows that. That was an amazing platform that they pulled. But so we've always worked sort of on the cloud. We've always been collaborative. And so really, Ryan leads the US projects and the Texan projects in terms of the day-to-day. We've had lots of different people in the office. And I've been sort of largely leading the African projects, but definitely more recently, we've been sort of more aggressively working on not just sort of the integration, because that happens already like us because we're all talking together and working together, but more in terms of the communication. I obviously didn't do the world's greatest job today, but we're still partly the work I shared now is moving into the architectural scale. And so that's why we're going through this process of documentation and sort of just aggregating all of the process to show the evolution of things which seemed, in a way, something that just exists almost like in an art world, and how actually we basically tried to hijack. We did literally, because during the pandemic we couldn't travel. So all of our previous field work where we would go, we couldn't do it. So we instead did it through these art installations where a museum would build a thing in Germany with people. So we used this network as a way of allowing production to continue through a network, even when we couldn't do it all. Yeah. Super good question. So in lots of different instances, we've done different things. I would say starting at the very beginning. So Ashley Heron was a kind of third partner when we sort of started. Then she, for about 8 years, set up Lake Flato's Austin office. And then she came back with LowDO, and now just like very recently, like hot off the press, she's now kind of gone out on her own and started her own office called Firm A. But many years ago, when we were actually in school, and this is like the origin story, we did a project with a bunch of other folks in Cape Town, South Africa, called Project Kailicha. And that was working with a group of women artists in the township who were also, for the most part, like single mothers. And so that involves sending a group to South Africa for a number of months to work with them on the design, and then early stage kind of like prototyping, and then they built it. It's now operational. But for that project, we specifically had Ashley lead it, and it was, for the most part, like an all-women team, because just these are women that we're dealing with a lot of times, like very like complicated or problematic kind of personal lives, and didn't necessarily need a bunch of dudes in the room trying to direct a process. So on one level, we try to be aware on that sense. In other contexts, for example, the work in Nigeria, where we worked with the local community, I mentioned that Igbo land is a Republican, like historically, it's like a kind of like a republic organized in this sense. So they have their own cultural ways of organizing activities. And one of the ways is actually very interesting. We had to have meetings with, they have age grades. So every 5 years is a group. So you don't just meet with everyone all together, you meet with groups of people who are all 5 years together, and then the next 5 years. And then sometimes they would then separate them by men and separate women separately. So it was a way of basically sometimes having everyone talk in a group, but other times talking to people separately, because as you know, sometimes people will be more comfortable voicing certain things in a separate space. So that's another way of saying we also sometimes do these kinds of approaches. And then finally, we're very collaborative. So even a lot of the work, for example, the spacecraft and the Fuvuzela, we also collaborated with Yasmin Abbas, who has had a design consultancy in Paris called Penn Urban, and now is also faculty at Penn State. And so she's been very active, especially in the sort of scrapyard spaces, trying to engage, because it was primarily a male-centric space, but there are women operating, not to say behind the scenes, but essentially doing parallel activities that are working in tandem with others. So that's a way of saying also just like having, let's say, the participants on a project coming from a diverse backgrounds as well, so that they can have their antenna up and have observational powers of saying, hey, did you see this? Have you noticed this? Like, we should also take this into account. Mm-hmm.
On that note, if Ghana would do something called global parents, which I'm not going to do. But thank you so much, DK, for this amazing